Avowed is a Concord level failure. Let's find out. Let's see.
Avowed is a pretty good time so far.
And Avowed is anything but extraordinary.
Avowed is a bit of fun here and there, but it's not in the least bit interesting.
I don't know if you've heard before, but Obsidian Entertainment made Fallout New Vegas, and they've been chasing that dragon ever since. Their most recent attempt to recapture the magic comes in the form of their Elder Scrolls clone, Avowed. At least, that's what they wanted to do, or wanted us to believe that they were going to do. But after a predictable, troubled development, what Avowed became was anything but. In 2018, looking to be acquired by Microsoft, Obsidian pitched a first-person RPG set in Aora. Aora being the universe that Obsidian's very well-received CRPG's Pillars of Eternity takes place. The original concept that was pitched was a quote-unquote blend of Skyrim and Destiny. The idea being that they would make the next big open-world first-person RPG, but make it live service. Now, I'm no industry expert, and I'm not a publisher. I'm just a guy with a microphone and way too much free time, but I can confidently say that this is one of the dumbest pitches for a game I've ever heard. But I also know one other thing. Nothing makes an investor or an executive pitch a tent in their pants more than the words live service being whispered into their ears. Throw Skyrim in there and I think your imagination can fill in what probably happened. They busted a fat nut. Now, do I believe Obsidian actually intended to go through with this? I don't know. I'm of the assumption it was just an attempt to entice Microsoft or another buyer to go through with purchasing Obsidian. Because mere months after development started and the Microsoft acquisition was finalized, the live service multiplayer aspects were scrapped. A new game director in Carrie Patel was brought on, and Avowed was to be the next big single-player RPG to rival the Elder Scrolls series. July 23, 2020, at the Xbox Games Showcase, the announcement trailer for Avowed was unveiled for the world to see, and boy did the world react. The trailer has nearly 2 million views as of the writing of this video. Now compare that to the release trailer Obsidian released about 5 months ago, and you can see there's a small disconnect between what Obsidian originally promised and what it delivered. Sitting down with an ice-cold Coke Zero and comparing the comments between these trailers really made for an entertaining night, and I cannot recommend it enough. It was clear from the announcement trailer in 2020 that Avowed was trying to compare itself to Skyrim, as the crescendo of the trailer was the unveiling of the first-person POV and the style of combat that any Elder Scrolls fan would recognize, with the character having a sword in one hand and a spell in the other. But that excitement didn't last long. Just a few months later, in January 2021, the project was quietly rebooted again. Emphasis on the quietly this time too. The direction of the game completely shifted. I would love to think that Obsidian really did want to swing for the fences and make the next big, great open-world sandbox RPG, harkening back to the golden age of Obsidian, but this second reboot basically killed any chance of that happening for Avowed. What did happen though? I'm not sure anybody outside of the development team knows for sure, but I would like to give my uninformed opinion if I may indulge myself here. I think that part of the issue could have been scope creep. Obsidian, perhaps, bit off more than they could chew, assuming Microsoft's deep pockets meant endless resources, and spoiler, it didn't. I'm not just pulling this out of thin air either. Obsidian's VP of Operations, Marcus Morgan, has described this so-called 100-year plan to keep Obsidian profitable and in business for, you guessed it, the next 100 years. I link the article below. It involves this culture of never going all in, and before a game gets greenlit, the studio, and I quote, spends a lot of time determining if the game will be a mild success. Now, while there is a lot to say about this philosophy, that is a whole video in and of itself. But for the purposes of this critique, this plan, at least to me, suggests that the team likely overestimated their post-Microsoft acquisition runway, and the reality of the budget, coupled with the studio leadership's seemingly unwillingness to overextend, is what was directly responsible for the pivot in January 2021. In an interview with Jason Schreier, I've also linked that below, director Carrie Patel framed the reboot as a way to align Avowed closer to the Pillars of Eternity's rich lore and setting. It's a solid idea, given Aora's status as one of fantasy's more interesting worlds, though I'm not entirely convinced that this is the real reason. But good intentions also don't erase bad execution. And this is the first of two severe failures of management in my opinion. Scope creep ran wild because no one reined in the ambition early. Poor communication left teams chasing conflicting goals. Patel herself admitted in 2024 in an interview that the team struggled to find a unified direction, which is basically code for we were all over the place. Systems built for an open world like exploration and combat had to be retooled for tighter zones, while elements like dialogue and choice and consequence probably had to be completely reworked for a new narrative and direction as well. The rushed post-reboot timeline forced compromises, leaving a game that's fun but it just feels half-baked. Obsidian's got the talent to make a great RPG, Pillars 1 and 2 are proof, but I think Avowed's development was a case of too much, too fast, and with too little focus and too little resources. The real kicker though is the fact that none of this was really communicated with the fans. Obsidian went radio silent, leaving us in the dark about what Avowed had become. Was it still a Skyrim clone? Was it more like the Outer Worlds? What happened to the mature, gritty tone? Nobody knew. This isn't new to Obsidian either. My Outer Worlds critique called out Obsidian's habit of letting mismatched expectations fester, and Avowed is yet another prime example. The 2020 trailer promised a grounded, mature, gritty RPG made by one of the best studios to make role-playing games in the world. But by 2025, we got a colorful zone-based action game with some light RPG elements. That disconnect wasn't just a developmental failure, it was a leadership failure. Overpromising from day one, then failing to clarify the pivot. This set Avowed up to fail. Scaling back is not a crime, but letting fans believe in a game that no longer exists is. I mean, technically that's not a crime either, but it kinda sucks that they did that. This is mismanagement at its finest, and it's the broken promise of Avowed. But, unfortunately, that's not all. As in early 2025, Avowed got caught up in what has become a fairly typical online firestorm. By now, you already know what that controversy was about.
Fucking pronouns!
Things blew up when Obsidian's art director, Matt Hansen, jumped on social media to defend it. Hansen basically sneered at critics, calling them dinosaurs stuck in 1995. Unsurprisingly, this rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Elon Musk then got involved on X, reposting a rant against pronouns in fantasy games, which only really added some fuel to the fire. Hansen then took to Blue Sky, which is somehow the only app that's more annoying than X, and he celebrated the fact that Elon didn't like his game. And what should have become a small design choice turned into a full-on political fight at this point. That's kinda par for the course these days, but the real problem came when people started digging into Hansen's older tweets, and that never goes well. Included in those tweets was one that was soaked in that sort of self-flagellating white guilt and corporate virtue signaling that really tends to stir people up online. The tweet basically offered priority to black artists seeking employment at Obsidian and was a self-admittance to illegal hiring practices. Musk jumped in on this, obviously, tagging Microsoft's CEO and calling it illegal. Asmongold jumped in and called it proud racism. But the surprising one to me was Obsidian's own co-founder, Chris Avellone, who urged people to sue over discriminatory hiring practices. Hansen's ongoing rants only poured more gas on the fire. Throughout all this, Obsidian and Microsoft totally botched the response. Worse yet, they basically stopped marketing the game entirely, letting Hansen's drama define the narrative. I mean, seriously, I remember being bombarded with KCD2 and Monster Hunter ads every day, but I don't think outside of the Hansen drama I saw one singular discussion of Avowed, or even an ad. This wasn't just bad PR, it was a mismanagement, again. Matt Hansen hijacked the game to turn it into his political soapbox and basically alienated a large portion of the audience, and there was no coherent response. Obsidian's silence let critics control the narrative, framing Avowed as pandering and ultra-woke. And because of this, Avowed became a cultural battleground, and this had a marked impact on sales. Now when Avowed finally launched, critics had fairly high praise for the game, and it landed with an 81 on Metacritic. But users hammered it with a 6.8 score, showing how different the critical and community reception was. Mismanaged expectations and the political target painted on the game invited a full-on dogpile. Even creators like Video Game Donkey jumped in with criticism.
Maybe it's unfair to compare these games because Star Providence was made by 4 people that wanted to make it, where Avowed was made by 100 people who didn't.
Who published Star of Providence, Donkey? Interesting. At any rate, the launch was rough. Steam's peak concurrent players were around 19,000, which isn't great, even counting Game Pass cannibalizing a portion of would-be purchasers. And the pricing for the game was crazy and not doing it any favors. $70 for the base game and $90 for early access. This should have been a $60 title, tops. Each one of these circumstances has resulted in Avowed being really a nothing burger. I would be utterly shocked to see this game in the zeitgeist in 5 years. Outside of the random YouTuber digging up the story and making a sort of retrospective. I can see it now. Was Avowed really as bad as everybody said? You know, the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced Avowed is basically Gen Z Kingdoms of Amalur. Avowed's broken promise boils down to a game that could have been something really cool, but was undone by its own chaos. The 2020 trailer set an expectation for a game that, thanks to mismanaged scope and a rushed timeline, would never be made. Combine this with the culture war that had marred the marketing, or lack thereof, and you have 2 masterclasses in mismanagement. That has resulted in a failed launch and a game that will be forgotten in 2 years. But in spite of all of this, there is still something to this game. I genuinely enjoyed my time, and through all the smoke and fog of unmet expectations, you can see the silhouette of something that could have been another Obsidian classic. Something that the fan base has been waiting for, and something that I'm growing more and more convinced can't happen with the current structure of the studio. This critique is structured in chapters with the goal of blending narrative and gameplay analysis, looking closely at both story and writing, as well as the game's systems and design. The hope is to shine a bit of light on the really good things about Avowed and critique the things that are bad. I also want to try and highlight how the mismanaged expectations once again marred an otherwise solid game. How well I pull that off remains to be seen, but that's the plan anyway. That said, I need to give the obligatory spoiler warning before we continue. So far, I've mostly just set the stage and shared some initial thoughts, but from here on out, there will be major spoilers, both visual and auditory for Avowed, as well as Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. So consider yourself warned. Avowed drops you into Eora's far frontier as an Adheran envoy, a godlike with strange fungal growth sprouting from your skin, tied to a god you don't know. In a world where most godlike have been killed in the fallout of Pillars 2. That makes you a walking rarity, and not necessarily a welcome one. And your mission is simple on paper. Secure Adir's hold on the living lands and put down the Dream Scourge, a soul plague spreading through the region. The plan collapses before you even set foot on shore. Your own forces attack your ship, smashing it into pieces just off of the coast of Paradise, the only Adheran foothold in this wild territory. The tutorial plays out here, combat basics, scavenging, looting, movement. It's functional, but there are also narrative seeds that are planted too. And I think this sequence works well as an opening hook. As you make your way through this fort, tripping over the corpses of your supposed allies that have just shot your boat to bits, you notice a lot of them are covered in a fungus that eerily reminds you of your own. Then a voice in your head pulls you towards an Adra pillar, a colossal spire of soul-infused stone. Moments later, you're face to face with a Dream-Scourged captain, his body overtaken by the same fungal growths that the dead soldiers were covered in. And it's an unmistakable implication. You're tied to the Dream Scourge in some way. The combination of the pillar's cryptic summons and the survivor's unsettling resemblance plants an immediate mystery in the player's mind. Not just, what is this plague, but what does it have to do with me? The next stop is Paradise itself, and here's where the game changes tone, and not really for the better. The arrival in Paradise should feel like a breathless step into a living alien frontier, but instead it slows into what feels like a guided museum tour. You meet Kai, an Almauan local with a knack for exposition. And within minutes, he's explaining like half the Deadfire Archipelago's history, the politics of Adir, and references a few gods and political figures while he's at it. Now, if you're a Pillars of Eternity veteran, you'll recognize this as the connective tissue, the game's way of threading the living lands into the broader Eora mythos. But for a newcomer, it's a deluge of terminology without any emotional anchor. And this is the game's onboarding problem in a microcosm. Instead of letting you experience the broader lore of Eora as you explore the living lands, it keeps telling you about it. In a way, it reflects what your envoy is experiencing, dropped in the deep end, trying to keep up with the local terminology and history. But the difference is that your character has the context of the world to build on, and you, the new player, don't. It also doesn't help that the Pillars universe is dense. Souls can reincarnate through this cosmic wheel, guided by Adra to the beyond. There are these people called the Ingwithans, an ancient civilization that's long gone, but they created the gods in order to keep order, a truth revealed in the first Pillars game. Then, in Deadfire, the god Aethys shatters the wheel of reincarnation, and that starves the gods of soul essence, so it forces them to kill most of their godlikes in order to continue to exist. And this, in turn, makes your godlike envoy an anomaly. But none of it is really explained to you. Instead, NPCs reference the divine mandate of Adir or the politics of Wodica, and they don't really ground any of those terms in any of this particular story's stakes. And this really drags down the pacing of the opening hours. You've just survived a wreck, you met your first ally, and you learned a bit about a missing ambassador and the local leader of Paradis, the Claviger, who were last seen near some Dreamscourge-infested cave. And this should be the moment that the narrative kicks back into gear. Instead, it lingers in conversation, and it front-loads lore at the expense of urgency. The mystery of who attacked your ship or why the plague mirrors your own godlike traits takes a backseat to lectures about far-off places that you've never been to. Avowed's intent is clear. Be self-contained enough for new players while rewarding Pillar's veterans with familiar threads. And to its credit, you can follow the broad strokes. I mean, Paradis is basically a story about colonizers versus locals. There's also the overarching plague that threatens both of them. I think this could easily be fixed by making just some of the more laborious lore dumps codexes that dedicated players could read. And that way, the Pillar's veterans can still experience the world that they love, while the new player doesn't have the pacing of the opening hours killed for the sake of learning about the friction between the Rawatian Navy and the Adiran Empire. After rescuing the ambassador from the aforementioned cave overrun by the Dreamscourge, and facing down a bear corrupted by said plague, the brutal fate of the Claviger becomes pretty clear. He was mauled to death by a bear high on mushrooms. You know, they say art is iterative, but this feels a lot more like plagiarism to me. This mysterious voice in my head then returns, and it urges me towards the Adra pillar here. And it promises me aid against the Dreamscourge, and it hints that my role in this land is intertwined with the Dreamscourge, and this really only reinforces what the environmental storytelling has been conveying. At any rate, the ambassador then tasks me with reporting my findings about the Dreamscourge and what happened to the Claviger with Inquisitor Ludwin, a death guard devoted to Wodica, the patron goddess of the Adiran Empire. Death guards are undead warriors, sustained by this sort of unwavering devotion to their patron god and/or cause. This devotion is so strong that it transcends death and keeps them alive. But alive, I guess, isn't the right word because they're dead, but they're also alive. It's complicated. Upon returning to Paradis to meet with Ludwin, a poisoned arrow strikes me down, and it kills me instantly. Yet, the voice in my head revives me, and it reveals that my soul carries a pretty rare and potent power. And after waking up at a local clinic, the healer directs me to a Watcher, one of the few people who can see souls. They can glimpse into the past reincarnations that your soul has gone through and commune with lost spirits. The Watcher confirms the strength and uniqueness of my soul, but cannot identify the mysterious voice that has sustained me or the deity of whose godlike I am. This brush with death and meeting with the Watcher deepen the mystery of who I am and my connection to this land, and I personally think this is a great hook. The story of my envoy's identity is something that drives me further into the living lands, trying to solve. I love a good mystery, and I think that the writers did an excellent job of threading these different narrative themes throughout the entirety of the story. I mean, there are themes of this sort of environmental activism, themes of identity, themes of second chances, and I think that players will pick up on those that resonate with them most. And this makes for a pretty rich narrative experience. One that unfortunately gets bogged down by poor character writing and dialogue and terrible pacing. Determined to find and stop my killer, Kai introduces me to Marius, a dwarf hunter and professional tracker from the frontier lands called Gallowayne's Tusks. Together, we track the killer through the city's sewers, and we confront this figure, who we come to find out is motivated not just by crazy violence, but political violence. His attack on me and attempted assassination, which was kind of successful but then wasn't, is a desperate strike against Adir's colonization. This tension isn't just confined to the dialogue here either, it's embedded in the world itself. With Paradis's orderly imperial districts standing in pretty stark contrast to the lawless shantytown inhabited by displaced locals, this story of oppressor and oppressed is told throughout all of this section of the Living Lands. And it's here the player faces a defining choice: kill the assassin to protect imperial order, or spare them acknowledging their grievance. There's also a third option of forcing a confession, but that basically just ensures that they're killed in an execution. And while this decision distills the core conflict of Paradis between the Adiran Empire's colonial ambitions and the locals' fight for freedom, and it lets the player shape the envoy's allegiances and identity in a rare role-playing moment, this tension that's supposed to be there between serving as the Empire's envoy and sympathizing with the locals doesn't really land as powerfully as it could. Because despite the fanfare about your role as the envoy, you have little tangible connection to Adir beyond title and mission. And this disconnect makes the choice to spare or kill the assassin hinge largely on your understanding of the locals' plight or personal feelings about being attacked, rather than a deeper narrative weight of sympathizing with the oppressed and loyalty to the oppressor. And I can see how this choice clearly foreshadows the game's later, larger-scale decision about empire and rebellion and security over freedom. It still feels detached and underdeveloped here, though. It leaves the story's pacing uneven, and the plot threads that we've been following, particularly the Dreamscourge mystery, feeling pretty disjointed, as this decision seems to have no real bearing on the voice in my head or the mushroom bears murdering people. Returning to the ambassador, I find him displeased with my choice to allow the assassin and his rebels to live, and soon after, I meet Inquisitor Ludwin for the first time. And it's here you pretty quickly notice the tension between Ludwin and the ambassador as they butt heads on how to accomplish their mission here in the Living Lands. This just adds to the envoy's complicated role in this entire story, because now not only must the envoy choose between the island and its inhabitants or the empire, but also between which method of how you will accomplish your mission from the emperor for the empire, if that's what you decide to do. This whole narrative arc, the envoy's death and rebirth, the mysterious voice, the watcher's soul reading, and the political choices that you have to make all kind of mirror the player's experience in Avowed's character creation and progression systems. You see, while a lot of the role-playing aspects of the character creation process are pretty bare bones, they still have an effect on how you decide to go about making these decisions and experiencing this game. Because as you create your character, you can come into the story with some preconceived notions about how you want to play and roleplay. From a gameplay perspective, it could be how you go about combat, as a warrior or a wizard. And from a narrative perspective, it could just be the background that you chose. But these preconceived notions that you come into the game with can change as you experience the story and the emerging gameplay, and it's something that Obsidian does pretty well, but it just lacks so much more depth that it could have. You see, character creation begins with a few choices. You can be a human or an elf, a male or female, or I guess body type 1 and 2. Now, Pillars fans might find it a little odd that you can only choose between being a human or an elf. This is explained in the game as being grounded in your role as the Adiran envoy, as it's a mostly human or elven empire. And while I understand that this is the lore explanation, I'm almost certain the real explanation is the armor textures and weapons wouldn't have worked for a dwarven or Almaoan body type. And they either didn't have the time or the resources to account for that, so we just got stuck with basic human or basic human with pointy ears. Overall, the character creator is okay. There's options for skin tone and scars and hair and sculpting the face and all of that stuff, but my personal tastes about the art style and direction make me feel pretty uninspired to really invest in creating a character that I love. You can then choose one of 5 backgrounds between the Arcane Scholar, the Court Augur, Noble Scion, Vanguard Scout, and War Hero. These all add some narrative and role-playing flavor, each providing unique dialogue and starting gear that hint at your envoy's past and personality. Mechanically, there's the classic Obsidian allocation of attribute points across Might, Constitution, Dexterity, Perception, Intellect, and Resolve, and this shapes a little bit how your envoy fights. And then there's the 3 ability trees, the Fighter, the Ranger, and the Wizard, and they offer pretty flexible toolkits, more flexible than, say, a rigid class system. This lets you mix and match melee, range, stealth, and magic abilities, and this encourages experimentation. You could, for example, take a lot of ranger abilities, but then pepper in a couple of buffing abilities that make you stronger or your ally stronger. Or perhaps you could take a lot of fighting abilities, but then throw in a couple of magic spells and become some sort of spellblade. Early access to powerful abilities keeps the combat pretty engaging from the beginning, but the limited ability points demand pretty thoughtful planning, though luckily respecking is cheap and easy, so you are encouraged to experiment. Now personally, I love the system's blend of freedom of build crafting mixed with those kind of archetypal classes that you can pick and choose from. It offers more flexibility than traditional class systems without devolving into the sprawling jack-of-all-trades approach seen in games like Skyrim. Multiclassing and hybrid builds feel good and exciting, and it encourages creativity while retaining enough structure to reward planning and synergy. It isn't without its flaws though. The system's onboarding is pretty thin. New players might struggle to grasp how abilities scale or combine, and the limited early ability points force difficult choices in the early game that can really limit players' expression of how they want to build their character. And this can result in the awful "it gets better after 10 hours" type of gameplay that a lot of people tend to bounce off of. The character system's open-endedness also risks frustrating those who prefer guided progression and don't appreciate the build crafting aspect. I could also see how the hardcore RPG fanbase could think it's very simplistic, which it is at first glance. But I personally found the depth surprising, and the different synergies between gear, abilities, and playstyle were really fun to experiment with. But when it comes down to it, the character creation and progression of Avowed is okay. Like a lot of things in this game, it has good bones. But there could have been so much more done with it. It doesn't really do anything new or exciting. It doesn't challenge the sort of status quo. It's just a solid system that does its job fairly decently. Avowed sets up the promise of a reactive RPG experience. Your choices should shape factions, influence the world, and impact how the story unfolds. Early on, you face a major decision in Paradise: kill, spare, or force a confession from the assassin. And this moment is pitched as one of the game's few major choices, supposedly reshaping the city's fractured dynamics between colonizer and displaced locals. And it should have long-term ramifications on the dynamic of Paradise. Yet, this promise quickly falls apart. Outside of an ending slide upon completing the game, there isn't much more than a few throwaway dialogue lines. The role-playing systems, the dialogue trees, the skill checks, the backgrounds, they all feel more like window dressing than any meaningful RPG mechanic. While your background and skill checks offer flavorful dialogue, the actual impact on quests or outcomes is negligible. Persuasion checks or intellect-based options rarely change the direction of a conversation or a mission. At best, they add minor lore snippets or a slight dialogue variation. At worst, they're meaningless. This means that your choices often only serve to let you roleplay the character you want to in your mind, without the game world reacting accordingly. This disconnect is especially disappointing given how static and lifeless the world feels. NPCs are stapled to the ground. They're stuck in place like mannequins with no regard for your actions. Stealing in broad daylight draws no reaction. Merchants don't care and guards don't notice. Try to attack somebody? Unfortunately, that's not possible. This lack of agency strips away the sense of immersion and consequence fundamental to a strong RPG. It's like the world's on autopilot. Instead of a living, breathing city, Paradise feels like a carefully constructed movie set, and it has no real pulse. And the same is said for every other major settlement and NPC interaction in the game. I think this shallowness stems from the developmental struggles I talked about earlier. I mean, the game was originally pitched as a reactive open-world RPG. But Avowed's pivot to a zone-based action game left many RPG systems gutted or superficial. All of the things that you technically need for an RPG are there. There's dialogue and skill checks and big choices. But it feels like they all took a back seat as resources shifted to other areas. And the result is a world that looks like it should respond, but doesn't. And I don't think anything sums this up better than the lockpicking mechanic. In order to pick a lock in Avowed, all that is required is to have the correct number of lockpicks. A hard chest will require 3 to 4 lockpicks. An easier one might require just 1 or 2. There is no skill check, there's no ability to unlock, no background to select, just have the correct number of lockpicks. And this is such a dumb thing to have included in the game. And to me, it just proves the point that it's only there because an RPG must have a lockpicking mechanic. It's shallow, and it's a microcosm of the issues that plague the role-playing aspect of this action role-playing game. Though there isn't a dumb minigame to unlock the chests, so at least they got that right. However, these shallow systems don't paint the whole picture, as Avowed's level design is a surprising bright spot. Paradise's environments invite exploration, with rewarding gameplay. The shipwrecked beach and the surrounding cliffs are carefully crafted with hidden nooks and secret caches, and vertical traversal that lean into the game's parkour system. As region director Berto Ritker explained, people are going to figure out a way to get up on the roofs. Let's lean into that and reward exploration. And they did. He also said around every corner there's a little something that somebody hand-placed for everyone, and this creates a world where players can feel like they're walking in the designer's footprints. This handcrafted approach balances pretty clear guidance with freedom. The main story path is always visible and straightforward, but following the untrodden paths, the narrow ledges, the broken walls, and hidden tunnels, these come with their own rewards. Ritker called these side routes an unspoken promise, that they're worth your time, turning exploration into a natural, engaging part of the experience rather than a chore. And this is the thing that I enjoyed the most in Avowed, which is a really odd thing for me to say about an Obsidian RPG. I never thought I would say that the role-playing aspects were weak, but the level design was incredible. This excellent level design also tells the story of the Living Lands in pretty subtle environmental ways. The contrast between the orderly imperial districts and the lawless shantytown outside the city walls illustrate the colonial tensions of Paradise, as I mentioned earlier. Overgrown ruins, abandoned watchtowers, and crumbling sewers paint a picture of a frontier in chaos, a world that's dangerous, mysterious, and alive. If only the NPCs could catch up with the level design. And all of this is compounded graphically, as Avowed presents a world that looks impressive and detailed, even if the art style isn't to everyone's tastes. The fungal growths, the ruined landscapes, the architecture, it all creates a very strong visual identity, and while I personally found the art style off-putting, it's important to recognize that style is subjective, and many players probably appreciate this game's aesthetic. Avowed's RPG system and world reactivity feels hollow, and it fails to deliver the depth and consequence expected from an Obsidian RPG. The NPCs are static, the world is unresponsive, and the choice impact is minimal. But within these flaws, the level design shines, providing rich, rewarding spaces to explore, and it subtly conveys what the game's narrative themes are. This contrast between the mechanical shallowness and environmental craft really just defines what Avowed is. It's reactive in appearance only. After the events in Paradise, the ambassador directs me to the city of Fior Messiverno, in the region of the Emerald Stair, and to the animancers who study souls and their essence through machines and arcane technology. In a world where animancy is deeply controversial and outright banned by the Adiran Empire, Fior represents a frontier where the pursuit of knowledge pushes against the imperial and religious boundaries and dogmas. It's among the animancers here that the ambassador hopes I can find some answers towards the Dream Scourge, and also perhaps exert a bit of Adiran influence. Upon arriving, it's clear that the Dream Scourge is having an effect on the Emerald Stair, as the crops are dying, and the Emerald Stair is the breadbasket of the Living Lands, so this is an issue for everyone, not just the pseudo-Italians of Fior Messiverno. Strange machines are scattered across the fields, and there are undead corpses that are reanimated as farmhands. Animancers are attempting to restore the land through scientific and magical means, yet their efforts so far have been largely ineffective. Inside the walls of Fior, the leader, Vidaro, clashes with an animancer named Giada. She is convinced that animancy holds the key to understanding and even curing the Dream Scourge. Vidaro, on the other hand, dismisses the plague as a myth and resists her research. With all experiments requiring Vidaro's approval, Giada's work is stifled, until, after a large falling out, directly in front of us, Vidaro exiles Giada. Determined to continue with her work and study of the Dream Scourge, Giada recognizes that exile, while not very fun, is a chance to freely work on her research. When my party offers her a place, she joins us, and she brings her expertise to our investigation. But first, she asks me to assist her fellow animancers with various tasks, earning goodwill that will aid her research. And this marks the arrival of our third companion. With our new ally, we journey to Naku Tedek, an ancient ruin linked to the mysterious godless civilization. At the Adra pillar here, the voice in my head reveals itself. Sapadal, a god unlike any other in Aora. Unlike the other gods, born of the Engwithan mass sacrifice, Sapadal arose naturally from the Living Land's isolated Adra network, which has acted like a terrarium, accumulating souls over centuries, as they are not connected to the broader network of Adra in Aora. Basically meaning the same process of gathering and condensing massive amounts of soul power to birth a god that the Engwithans did artificially happened naturally here. This in turn makes Sapadal the only natural god in the world, and this has massive ramifications for Aora as a whole, but any new player to the series wouldn't understand that at all. And it's at this point that the story stops focusing on figuring out what's going on inside of my head and my connection to it, and instead it shifts to this completely unknown deity trapped on this island. For longtime Pillars fans, that might be an interesting hook, but for a new player, the motivation to free Sapadal feels pretty weak and uninspiring. So far, the narrative to me has just felt very scattered, and this change just makes it even harder to follow. Even the conversations with Sapadal, where they're trying to learn more about morality in the world through my experiences, feel disconnected and confusing. And the strong hook of discovering who you are and why it matters kind of disappears, and it's replaced by something that just doesn't pack the same punch in my opinion. But I also personally find mysteries much more compelling, so that could just be a personal issue I have with the mystery of Sappadol being solved roughly a third of the way through the game. Now, the main narrative theme of the Emerald Stair is that of pushing boundaries and experimentation, and this kind of reflects what I experience in combat. Alright, that was maybe a stretch, but you guys tried tying the narrative themes to the gameplay systems you're trying to critique. This shit is not easy, so just go with it, give me a break. Avowed's combat system stands out as one of the better parts of the game, combining fast-paced first-person action with some RPG depth. Though it's nothing like the depth that you would expect from a CRPG, which is fine as this game clearly isn't that. Combat is fast, snappy, busy, but it also has those elements of strategic thinking and that slower tactical analysis that allows the player to scan the battlefield and come up with a plan. Especially on the harder difficulties, it sometimes requires the player to map out in their head the best way possible to tackle a particular situation. What I love about it though is the emphasis on experimentation and build crafting. I touched on it a bit in the character building critique section, but the cheapness of respeccing and the unique items you find throughout the world allows for you to test new things and try new combinations. Combine that with the loadout system that allows you to immediately switch from one loadout to another, and it can allow for some really cool synergies. I really enjoyed opening up combat by blasting somebody in the head with a musket and then getting in close with whatever melee weapon I had. If there were archers or mages on a ledge, I could quickly swap back to the musket and take care of them, and the whole thing just allowed for a very fluid gameplay experience. Now, the combat hinges on managing two resources: stamina for striking, dodging, and sprinting, and essence for all the spells and abilities. And in theory, it's the game's way of not allowing the player to overcommit to one specific thing and blend the abilities they have with the basic attacking, dodging, and jumping and sprinting mechanics. It emphasizes strategic pacing. Basically, it's just trying to stop you from button mashing the light attack button or the dodge button. The drawback here is it can really interrupt the flow of combat when both resources run out. If you've somehow mismanaged your consumables or you just got overextended, you could find yourself just running around in circles waiting for these meters to fill back up so you can play the game again. This is not necessarily a bad thing as it rewards planning and resource management, but it is a point of friction in the system that some players might come across. Defensively, blocking with a shield or an empty hand absorbs damage, but it can sometimes trap you in some longer animations. It's the same with dodging, and the decision not to let the player dodge forward is a little odd in my opinion. I personally never really blocked as I felt the combat was more fluid and rewarding if I simply just dodged out of the way. You also have different armors, and the armor choices impact these dynamics as well. Heavier gear reduces your stagger and improves your recovery speed after you've been hit or block an attack, but it also penalizes your stamina and essence, so this makes equipment more meaningful beyond just which one has the highest defensive stat. And the game comes with a pretty standard action radial menu, which organizes abilities, consumables, and throwables. And it really can bog down combat if you're trying to hunt down the ability you want to use in the correct part of the menu. You also have companions which add a little bit of tactical variety, though they don't necessarily add very much in terms of damage output. They do, however, have plenty of utilitarian abilities that can help control the field of battle. Kai taunting the boss of an arena and then activating his shield that greatly reduces the incoming damage of the boss would allow for me to clean up the adds quickly and then focus on maximum damage output on the boss. Weapon archetypes also offer different distinct playstyles. From fast swords to heavy hammers to bows to homing wands to offhand grimoires to guns, the variety supports hybrid builds, and being a gun mage is pretty damn sweet in Avowed. And there is also a pretty lightweight elemental accumulation system, where applying effects like fire, shock, frost, poison, or bleed builds towards some strong debuffs. Frost accumulation, for example, culminates in the enemy being frozen, and then if struck with explosive damage, say from a grenade or a massive warhammer, it causes them to shatter, doing some pretty big damage. It's a nice layer of synergy that isn't over the top and too in your face, like say for example the primer and detonator system of Dragon Age the Veilguard. Enemy design keeps fights pretty engaging. The variety isn't the greatest, but it's good enough in my opinion. The AI is affected by the difficulty setting, and I noticed in my Path of the Damned playthrough that the AI was much more aggressive and allowed a lot less room to breathe. The archetypes of enemies, from weak fodder to tanky defenders, ranged attackers, big damage casters, and healers, require the player to consider takedown order on the higher difficulties, which I enjoyed. And the combat rhythm, this sort of pressure, dodge, stun, finish, repeat, kind of channels this Soulsborne-like flow, making more tense encounters rewarding without being overly complex. Minor drawbacks like the occasional UI lag or weird enemy interactions, like them getting stuck on terrain, can be a bit jarring, but it never really detracted from the fun that I had. The critiques I've seen online about the combat getting kind of samey make sense, but I personally experimented so much with all of the different builds and combat styles and synergies, and that made for a pretty fresh combat experience for me, in every new zone. And that's about until halfway through Shatterscarp, where I stumbled into this insane build and I thoroughly enjoyed using that and I finished the game out with that one. Overall, I think that the combat is a really solid system that is fun and punchy, and Obsidian deserves their flowers for being one of the very few developers to make a first-person melee combat system that feels good. It's a system that, if a player wants to get the most fun out of it, requires a bit of experimentation. Like how the Animancers of Fior experimented. You see how it all kind of connects? Whatever. After the revelations at Nakutadek, Sapidal reveals more about their past. Once worshipped by an ancient civilization called the Godless, they are a deity apart from the rest of Aora's pantheon, one that many modern people simply assume never existed. The murals in the Godless ruins show a people that are pretty hostile to the current divine order, which fits with Sapidal's imprisonment in a mysterious place called the Garden. It infers that the current pantheon perhaps has something to do with Sapidal's imprisonment. To learn more about this and how to free Sapidal, I'm directed to seek out the Tabaru Sanakius, who might have more answers. But as I process this, the situation on the ground quickly spirals out of control. Exiting the temple, I witness Fior burning, being raised by Ludwin and the Steel Garrote. Their preemptive strike is meant to stop the spread of Animancy and the Dream Scourge. They see Fior's practices as a threat to Wodika and the Adiran Empire, and it's something that must be extinguished. Thankfully, a side quest gives me a chance to mitigate the fallout. A suspected traitor in the Fior military, named Ranger Dorso, reveals the location of the Steel Garrote's forces in a nearby cave if you do the side quest. If you then go to that cave and take down the enemy troops, it will weaken the assault, lessening the destruction enough to alter the city's fate. But even with this victory, the question of Fior's survivors looms pretty large. Vidaro, the leader of the city, urges sending the refugees to Paradise, trying to hide them directly under the Empire's nose, where they will never think to look for them. At the same time, Quilichi, which is like an elder of the city, argues for a relocation to the harsher but safer Thirdborn. I personally chose to send the Animancers to Thirdborn, as seeing how the Adirans have treated innocent Paradisans, I could only imagine how illegal Animancers would be treated if they were found out. But it wasn't really that difficult of a decision for me to make, and the way it's framed, sending the Animancers to Thirdborn is really the right option. The big decision to decide the fate of the region at the end of that region's arc is basically the only sort of choice and consequence involved in the game. And while there are a few decisions later on for me that were incredibly difficult and thought-provoking, this one right here was probably the weakest of the game. I've already touched on it, so I won't beat a dead horse, but the reactivity to even these big regional decisions is basically non-existent outside of the ending slides you get at the end of the game. And it feels like they're just there because it's an Obsidian game and it's a requirement, but not because it actually serves the story, at least at this particular moment. But much like how the people of Fior must choose how to endure, whether by risking the dangers of Shatterscarp or hiding away in Paradise, your Envoy's strength comes from choosing their approach, and power is built through thoughtful itemization, unlocking synergies between the build you pursue and the gear you choose to wear. How's that for connecting the theme to the gameplay critique? Damn, I'm good. Avowed's itemization boils down to how gear tiers impact combat effectiveness. Each item has a rarity and a sub-tier within that rarity. It's the classic MMO system: common, fine, exceptional, and superb. These are the qualities of each item, and the unique items can be upgraded past superb to legendary. And within those qualities, there is a tier system, going from 0 to +3. So, for example, you could have a fine longsword +3, which is one tier away from being an exceptional longsword. Now, before patch 1.2.2, wielding a weapon that was a few tiers below an enemy's armor cut your damage output by a harsh 50%. And wearing outdated armor meant you'd take significantly more damage with each hit. And this made fights against higher tier enemies feel unfair, as the quality of your gear was the only deciding factor on if you would succeed and not how you actually played in that particular encounter. This patch softened the system, introducing a more gradual penalty that only kicks in at a 4 sub-tier gap. This allows you to remain at least a little bit competitive if your gear is slightly behind. Still, falling too far behind, say using a common tier wand against an exceptional tier skeleton, basically softlocks you out of progressing until you have upgraded your gear. But the good news is, the quality of items you find in the world is based on the quality of items you have equipped, so you are never punished for upgrading a weapon or an armor piece. If you spend the resources to make your favorite sword the best you can make it, the other uniques and items you find will be around the same tier as the sword. So, if you find something that seems more interesting to build around, you aren't punished for spending those resources on your previous weapon. What truly elevates Avowed's itemization for me though is its unique gear, which ties directly into the build customization and combat mechanics. For example, I found a sword called Karnet's Cutlass, which would increase my attack speed by 15% for 10 seconds after killing an enemy. I then combined this with a dagger that I found called the Umbral Needle, which has a lifesteal on hit ability, and synergized it with any and all abilities that would increase the amount of enemies I could hit at one time and the speed I could hit them. And this in turn basically created an invincible vampire build where as quickly as I would lose health, I would gain it back without the need to use any health potions. This approach allows gear to drive your build choices. Though if you have a specific build in mind, it also incentivizes exploration to find a unique piece of armor or weapon that has an ability that will synergize with the style of build you want to create. And the respec system ties this all together by letting you quickly and cheaply reshape your skills to match your new gear you've discovered. Finding a powerful wand, for instance, inspired me to pivot towards a wizard build on the fly. And this freedom keeps experimentation fresh, and it's one of the reasons why I disagree with the complaint of combat feeling samey after a while. That said, some unique gear effects aren't clearly explained, and the game doesn't always indicate which skill synergizes best. Also, some of the gear just kind of sucks outright. You often have to rely on trial and error to uncover the good combos. This occasional lack of clarity can slow the fun down early on. But once you discover these synergies, itemization becomes one of Avowed's most satisfying systems. The Tabaru Sinakis we are after are apparently the old godlikes to Sapidol, just like we are, and are supposed to be out there somewhere. And thankfully, Yatsley, our resident furry and expert on godless, knows where they might be. She points us to the largest of the godless ruins, Naku Kubel, in the region of Shatterscarp. Time is pressing though, as Yatsley's research was stolen during the attack on Fjord, and she suspects that Ludwin is also racing to find the garden and eliminate Sapidol before we can free them. This probably has something to do with Wodika being Ludwin's patron and how Sapidol ended up being imprisoned. That's called foreshadowing. As I leave the Emerald Stair, I am confronted by the Steel Garrote and Ludwin's commander, who attempts to parley with me, but I wasn't exactly in a parley mood. When we arrive at Shatterscarp, things are not going well, as the town of Thirdborn is basically under siege by Dream Thralls. Inside, I meet Temerty, the leader of Thirdborn. She shows me a threatening missive from the Steel Garrote that has been sent to her that demands that the ruins of Naku Kubel be surrendered, or the wrath of the Steel Garrote will fall upon Thirdborn. Temerty refuses to give in to the Steel Garrote, but even if she wanted to, she couldn't, as a powerful magical barrier created by the Archmage Ringgren blocks access to Naku Kubel, thus making Ringgren the next person we have to confront. The Archmage Ringgren is a terrifyingly powerful mage who is here investigating the ruins of Naku Kubel and their connection with the Dream Scourge. She's a really interesting character who looks at the world from a much longer term perspective than most people, as archmages tend to live a very, very long time. And she tests us with illusions and tells us a parable and then forces us to fight off a horde of skeletons before even agreeing to talk to us. But once we do talk to her, we have the chance to reveal the knowledge about Sapidol, and this is the missing piece in her research on the Dream Scourge. So she ultimately allows us to destroy the ice barrier and enter the ruins, as she is convinced us being Sapidol's godlike will allow us to unlock the secrets of the ruin and the Dream Scourge. Upon entering, we're greeted by the spirits of the Tabaru Sinakis. They are supposed to help us be able to free Sapidol from their imprisonment. However, before allowing us to proceed, they insist on a test to prove that we're ready. And this puzzles Sapidol themselves. Why wouldn't they help someone clearly connected to them? Surely the initiation process could be fast-tracked given the circumstances. As we learn, the Tabaru Sinakis have no intention of freeing Sapidol. They believe Sapidol must remain imprisoned to prevent another calamity. It's here the truth surfaces. Sapidol is the cause of the Dream Scourge. The strange fungal growths and the poetic, dreamlike speech of the infected all reflect Sapidol's influence. Long ago, when Sapidol first appeared, they and the godless people protected each other. But Sapidol was also unpredictable and unstable. Through memories of the previous godlikes to Sapidol that you can discover throughout the Living Lands, you see that there have been many occasions where Sapidol unknowingly or uncontrollably released calamity on the godless people, just as they are doing now with the Dream Scourge. But after the current gods, particularly Wodica, discovered Sapidol's existence, she sought to erase it. Wodica then imprisoned Sapidol in the garden and unleashed destruction on the godless, wiping out their history and all knowledge of Sapidol. And Sapidol, being overwhelmed and unable to stop the devastation Wodica was unleashing on her and the godless, unleashed her own devastating rage, and it caused storms and floods and fires. And it completely devastated the Living Lands, changing entire areas of the island, and it killed the rest of the godless people that had survived Wodica's attack. The Tabaru Sanakis fear that freeing Sapidol would unleash this calamity once more, and this revelation casts Sapidol in a pretty morally ambiguous light. They express remorse to us and claim that their fragmented memory from their imprisonment has caused an unintentional deception during our journey, and it wasn't what they intended to do, hiding the Dream Scourge's source from us, that is. But before we can even reflect on this, Sapidol senses a nearby threat, the arrival of Inquisitor Ludwin. This fear and anger Sapidol feels of Wodica's champion causes them to unwittingly draw all of the Dream Thralls in Shatterscarp to these ruins, nearly killing us in the process and proving once again that they are very unstable. And, again, a critical choice looms. Ludwin wants to destroy the ruins and wipe out all of the Dream Thralls inside of the ruins by any means necessary. Ringrim, however, argues this is only a temporary fix and proposes severing the Adra connection in the region, cutting off the Dream Scourge at its root, essentially ending the plague, and there would be no more new Dream Thralls being created in Shatterscarp. This would effectively end the plague in Shatterscarp and save Thirdborn from the relentless attacks of the Dream Scourge. The cost of Ringgrim's plan, however, is high, as it requires vast magical essence, meaning many people in Shatterscarp, including possibly our companions and loved ones, will be sacrificed by a forced lottery. The decision affects the region's fate immediately, and it echoes in the in-game slides. Choosing Ringgrim's path means hundreds will die in the sacrifice, but survivors in Shatterscarp will make it back to Thirdborn, which solemnly begins to bury and honor its dead. Temerity, however, is furious at the Envoy's decision to side with Ringgrim. Around Shatterscarp, you can see bodies of the spell's victims lying scattered. It's one of the few times there is a direct reaction to the Envoy's decision. Conversely, siding with Ludwin eliminates all of the Dream Thralls inside of the ruins, but the infection persists, and the surrounding areas begin to experience more and more Dream Scourge. Thirdborn becomes overrun with fungus, and the Scourge spreads beyond the town's borders, infecting places previously untouched. And it really feels like a no-win situation. What further complicates this decision is that the main antagonist outside of the Dream Scourge, Inquisitor Ludwin, seems to be the person who is presenting the morally right and acceptable decision here. So what could seem like the easy decision, to eliminate the Dream Thralls and hope that the infection doesn't spread too quickly before we can stop it, feels wrong, as it's what our enemy wants. That is, if you aren't playing a character whose main goal is to increase Adir's control of the Living Lands, then it's a fairly simple decision. And this is one of the few times in recent memory where a decision I made in a game was difficult. It was thought-provoking, it left me torn, and there wasn't the cookie-cutter good and evil decision. It was a helpless feeling, and I loved every second of it. The addition of Ludwin being the voice of reason complicated it even more, and it really felt like the old writing of Obsidian classics had kind of seeped through here. And my only complaint is that the entire game wasn't written this well. And this continual narrative loop following the Envoy of finding a new problem and trying to overcome it, only to move on to a new area with a new problem, mirrors the core gameplay loop of the game as well. Avowed's gameplay loop of exploring and fighting and collecting gear and upgrading it and then repeating is the heart of its appeal. Exploration draws you into caves and ruins that dot the landscape. and it rewards curiosity with hidden caches of Adra and upgrade materials, or even a new weapon or piece of armor. And these discoveries feed directly into combat. You explore a dangerous place and you fight a tough enemy, and then you're rewarded. The itemization then ties it all together. Upgrading gear and finding unique weapons directly impacts your combat style. Clearing out a ruin, or finding a treasure map, or doing a side quest will reward me with a piece of gear that can completely change the way that I approach exploring and fighting. And then I take this new build and I go into the next ruin that rewards me with more build changing gear. This loop of explore to find loot, fight to test your build, upgrade to get stronger, and repeat is Avowed's strongest aspect. The unique gear encourages experimentation and it shapes your playstyle. The loot system scaling flexibility means that you're not punished for investing in your favorite gear. Each ruin, fight, and upgrade feeds the next. And it creates this cohesive, rewarding cycle that kept me hooked throughout the entire game. But it really becomes fully fleshed out in Shatterscarp in my opinion. Yet despite these strengths, the experience leaves me conflicted. I didn't want Avowed to be a looter shooter, I wanted it to be a deep and meaningful RPG. But the core gameplay loop, as fun as it is, often feels closer to what a looter shooter excels at, grinding for gear and tweaking builds and facing waves of enemies. The RPG systems around it, the character building and dialogue and story choices, feel half-baked or underdeveloped in comparison. Avowed would have been far better served leaning into the looter shooter style, with more varied boss fights, deeper build crafting options, and an expanded pool of unique gear. Perhaps even a new game plus mode to add replay value. Those changes would have embraced what the game actually delivers well, rather than struggling to be what it only partially achieves. In the end, Avowed's gameplay loop is a great example of what the game does right, carrying the player through its weaker narrative and RPG elements. And it's a bittersweet realization, because I wanted a great RPG, but Avowed as it stands feels like a great looter shooter trapped inside an unfinished RPG shell. Before we go any further, I want to talk about the companions that journey with the Envoy throughout the Living Lands, as the final companion, Yatsley, is recruited in Shatterscarp and the group is now complete. The first companion we meet was Kai, back in Paradise. Now the astute here will notice almost instantly that Kai is voiced by Brandon Keener, who voiced Garrus in Mass Effect. And I can't say for certain, but to me it feels almost like he was written to mimic Garrus. He speaks in sort of the same way, how he enunciates and the accent he speaks with. This, however, is where the comparisons to Garrus sort of end. Like most Almauans, Kai is from Rauatai, a harsh land plagued by constant storms. So its people often roam to other regions when they can to try and settle somewhere else. Rauatai is also known for its powerful navy and its imperialistic tendencies, due to the fact that the homeland for the Almauans is fairly inhospitable. Now, Kai was a part of the Rauataian navy in their campaign in the Deadfire Archipelago. And the inhabitants of the Deadfire Archipelago didn't exactly take too kindly to the Rauataian navy showing up on their doorstep, and fighting broke out. And Kai began questioning how war could do anything positive for the people in Rauatai, and he decided to desert. He then did some dirty work with a few mercenary bands before finally ending up in the Living Lands. Now, when we first entered the Emerald Stair, Kai asked the Envoy if they could help him visit a friend's cabin, his friend Tama. Tama was the leader of Kai's mercenary band that he joined when he got to the Living Lands, and they had a deep bond. You can even see in Tama's cabin that he had painted a portrait of Kai before he had died. After we arrive in Shatterscarp, Kai tells us the full story. During a patrol, Tama was ambushed alongside Kai and the other members of the band, and he was injured. He managed to return to Thirdborn, but his condition worsened. And while Kai was sitting next to Tama's bedside as he was dying, Kai noticed that Tama's badge, something that he would have never taken off, was missing. And he used this as an excuse to leave, promising to return with it, though Tama wanted him to stay. You see, Kai couldn't face the loss of Tama, or sit there at his bedside while he slowly died. So Kai left not only Tama, but he also left Thirdborn, and he never went back. Kai's story is a story about someone who refuses to reconcile their past and is ashamed of a decision that they've made. He uses humor as a defensive mechanism, and whenever he seems to be getting close to anyone, he pushes them away, as he feels like all he's ever done is let people down like he let Tama down. At the end of Kai's quest, you have the chance to take him to Tama's grave and have him confront his past. The Envoy also has a chance to set Kai in a direction. The direction is to either reconcile with his past or continue to run from it. Later, in the garden, where each companion faces deeply personal moments created by Sapidol to learn about the people that the Envoy has trusted on this journey, Kai has to come to terms with Tama's death. Not just his final moments on his deathbed either, but everything Tama truly meant to him. And this helps Kai move past his regrets and realize they do not define him. I like Kai a lot, actually. Maybe it's just because he reminds me of Garrus, but I think he has one of the most compelling stories of the companions. And the very early access you have to him, as he joins the party almost immediately, makes the friendship the Envoy develops with Kai feel pretty genuine. Kai was also written by Carrie Patel, the director of the entire game, and I think it's really cool that she gets the chance to flex her writing skills, as she is also the author of a few fiction books and is pretty talented as a writer. The second companion is Marius, and he once lived in Soulless Keep, in the area of the Living Lands called Galawain's Tusks, but just like Kai, he bailed and never returned. He is reserved about his past, and throughout the game he gets upset if the Envoy pushes him to learn more. It's not until the party arrives at Galawain's Tusks that you learn more about Marius, as it's revealed through a panic attack he has that he clearly has PTSD from some trauma, and his mind has blocked this from his memory. Marius has these visions of a village, which we later learn was where he and his family were as a child, under the leadership of a cult leader named Razvan. Razvan believed that he could make his followers ascend to immortality, but only if they drank the Kool-Aid, if you catch my drift. And Marius watched as his family died in front of his eyes as a young boy. And all of this happening around him scarred him mentally, and it's the reason for the lack of memory and the anxiety he has in Galawain's Tusks. Thanks to his friend Iancu, Marius was able to survive the events of Razvan's cult, but what happened there was wiped away from history. But this mystery of what happened to his family, which his brain is blocking from him ever remembering, is what fueled his departure from Soulless Keep, because nobody would ever explain to him his past or his parents, and he felt like everybody had a big secret they were keeping from him. But if you bring Marius back to that village, all of the pain that he's been suppressing and all of the memories come to the surface. But it also leads us to finding his friend Iancu, who is suffering from the Dream Scourge and is about to become a Dream Thrall. Iancu, however, cryptically tells us that Razvan is still alive and is still here, and Marius demands that we confront him, so he can't hurt anybody else like he did him and his family. Though that confrontation isn't exactly as Marius pictured, as Razvan has gone pretty insane. Apparently he's a watcher and didn't know it, and the voices he was hearing that convinced him he could give his followers immortality are just the voices of the dead souls that he can see and hear. And now he's been sitting in a dark cave for years being tortured by these dead souls, and it's led to a psychotic break. The choice then becomes to either kill Razvan or let him live out his days in madness. I chose to let him live, as that's what Marius wanted. And if you refuse to kill Razvan, it brings Marius peace. He finally understands his past, and in the garden, Marius has one last conversation with Iancu, who is no longer dream scourged, or at least this version of him isn't. And Iancu urges him to stop merely surviving and start truly living. Marius is probably the least popular companion in the entire game, so it may come as a surprise to many of you that I actually really enjoyed Marius and his story, but I understand why he isn't popular, as he suffers from that unfortunate millennial Marvel Disney writing where everything is a comedic, sarcastic comment to relieve the tension, and it can really grate on you. I originally also didn't really like his character, but his story arc and his fight with his trauma and trying to understand where he comes from and the place that he has in this world and overcoming all of this fear is really well done in my opinion. It's just a shame that you have to wait until like the last 7 or 8 hours of the game to get to that point with Marius, but for me it really redeemed his character. Our third companion is Giada, and for some inexplicable reason, she and Yatsli don't even get a companion quest. Her parents were also animancers and died during an experiment that transformed them into this weird tree-like being. This trauma drives Giada's desire to complete her parents' work. But throughout the journey, she's constantly questioning her career, and she realizes that she's no closer to finishing her parents' work than when the Envoy first met her. In the garden, she is confronted again by the preserved bodies of her parents and some other trees, and these are called the Green Whisperers. They are spirits bound to unliving vessels created by Sapidol's influence. You see, when Giada's parents were doing the animancy experiments, they unknowingly contacted Sapidol in the garden. And when a mere mortal comes into contact with a god, it's almost never good. Sapidol, who's been isolated in prison for centuries, if not millennia, fashion these beings as imaginary companions, trying to alleviate loneliness. The Whisperers in the garden apologize to Giada on Sapidol's behalf, and the player can decide if they want to push Giada towards forgiving Sapidol or condemning them. And it's at this point that Giada's future is undecided, She can either continue pursuing animancy on her own terms or abandon it entirely, freed from her parents' legacy. It's up to the Envoy to give Giada the advice on what to do and to set the course for her future, after the Dream Scourge is cured anyway. Giada's boring. I think she's one of the weaker companions, as while her story of her past trauma and motivations are pretty solid, she doesn't really add much to the dynamic of the party. The irony here being is that she's one of the best party members to bring along, as her skill set allows her to buff the Envoy with insane attack speed and defensive boosts. Giada provides context to certain lore-heavy concepts related to essence and animancy, but as an actual friend you can develop a relationship with, there just wasn't much there for me. And finally we have Yatsli. She is the foremost expert on the Godless, living in Fior with her husband Quilici, who also happened to take in Giada after the accident. Her talents have given her many paths. After investigating Archmage Ringgren, Yatsli is offered an apprenticeship with her. Now, an apprenticeship with an Archmage is basically like winning the lottery, and it would allow Yatsli to continue her magical studies and grow in her personal power beyond pretty much the entirety of Aora. But it would also mean leaving Quilici behind, and also her studies into the Godless. However, in the midst of all this, Yatsli has had this reoccurring dream that's haunting her. It's a mysterious library filled with books and tablets, and it's overseen by a figure that she later recognizes in the garden as a librarian. The librarian was a past incarnation of Yatsli's self, or her soul anyway. The librarian cataloged the history of the Godless to preserve it before dying by poison, refusing to let Woedica erase their legacy. And now comes the decision. Yatsli must decide whether to stay in Fior with Quilici, her lover, train under Ringgren, and become one of the Living Land's greatest mages, or take up the mantle of the librarian to preserve the Godless history, lest it be lost forever. While Yatsli's character motivations may be the weakest of the group, she at least adds to the dynamic a little bit by making jokes and jabs at Marius in particular, which I found semi-entertaining. She's also a sexual deviant and suffers a bit from that millennial writing I spoke about with Marius, but she isn't the worst character in the history of gaming, but she's not very high up there either. If I had to rank the companions of Avowed, it would be 1 Kai, 2 Marius, 3 Yatsli, and 4 Giada. But I don't think I would ever really rank them like that. The best I would do would be a tier list, and I don't think any of them would be over a B tier. I don't think any of them can really compare with the truly great companions that are in many other RPGs. I think Obsidian themselves have made better companions in Parvati and Vicar Max from the Outer Worlds, and they weren't particularly special either. The one thing I do want to give praise to Obsidian for is their decision to not include some sort of disposition meter, as the gamification of building relationships with companions is something that I detest. You see, a good companion and a good relationship with a companion is one that the player can develop over time. And over that time, if the player is playing their character in a way that aligns with the worldview and morals of the companion, it should be a natural friendship that forms. And if not, natural rivalries should form. That is a sign of a well-written companion in my opinion. However, where Obsidian made their biggest blunder was not having the ability to have a rivalry or even develop a negative relationship with a companion. There isn't really anything you can say or do besides siding with Ludwig at the very end of the game that will cause your companions to turn on you or leave you, even if what you are doing goes against everything they claim to stand for. And overall, the companions are okay. Some of them are really bad, some of them are pretty decent, but they're just there, and it never really feels like they add too much to the story. But I am curious what your guys' thoughts on the companions were, because there can be companions that resonate with people differently, kind of like how Marius did with me towards the end. And it's always so interesting to see how other people react to and form relationships with companions compared to how I do in games like this. The path to the garden to free Sapidol takes us through Galawain's Tusks. It's home to the Living Land's Pargrunan dwarves. After arriving in Galawain's Tusks, we travel down the road towards a long collapsed bridge that was supposed to carry us to the garden. But this bridge being collapsed, and our path to the garden being blocked, means only one thing. We have nowhere to go and no leads. Except for one, which is in Solace Keep. Inside the keep, the party meets 2 council members with opposing visions for their people. You have Mihala, who is a staunch traditionalist, and believes that nobody should ever leave Solace Keep, following the founder Nandru's words to the letter and protecting both the keep and the garden. Kostia, by contrast, is ready to gamble the dwarves' future, even selling the keep off to Adir, if it means his people can live beyond their walls. It's basically just Balin and Haramont from Dragon Age Origins. The problem is, though, that neither of them will reveal the garden's location to the party, so we're still on our own. Except for a little hint that we get from Kostia. This hint leads us to the mines of Mount Forgia, where Ludwin and her Steel Garrote soldiers are discovered to be infected with the Dreamscourge. As we clear our way through the mines, a map on a nearby table shows Soulless Keep circled over and over, implying that the garden's entrance is inside, and that Kostya may have leaked this information. But after making this discovery, we hear fighting, and when we chase down the source of said fighting, it's at the summit of Mount Forgia. And it's here we see Ludwin clashing with some of the remaining forces, and she plants the flag of the Steel Garrote in the ground and declares her vision of the living lands being united under one banner, one people, and one god, and one law. Sapidol gets enraged by her words, and she kind of explodes and infects all of the remaining soldiers nearby with the Dreamscourge. And this proves yet again that Sapidol's emotional instability is extremely dangerous. Now, if the Envoy has built enough favor with Ludwin through their earlier decisions, in this conversation, she will believe that the Envoy is acting of their own free will and is not under Sapidol's control, and then she will ask to ensure that Sapidol is killed. If she doesn't believe you're acting under your own free will and that you're under the control of Sapidol, she'll fight you at the top of the mountain. And when you defeat her, her Death Guard nature pretty much ensures that she's not actually dead. Returning to Soulless Keep with the information, Sapidol's outburst has awakened the dormant volcano that was beneath the keep. Lava is now rising and threatening the keep's destruction. And Kostya volunteers to activate the ancient gears that can stop it, basically to open these giant lava sluice gates. But we know that he has this desire to see the keep destroyed, and this kind of casts doubt on his intentions. So we chase him down, and here the Envoy must choose to side with either Mihala to save the keep, or to aid Kostya in destroying it for the sake of dwarven freedom, or a third choice, which is to kill Kostya, but then still let the keep be destroyed, which forces Mihala into a unwanted leadership of a free Pargrunan people. Similar to Shatterscarp, the choice here made me pause and think. On one hand, I didn't want the Pargrunan to be bound by the mandate of a dead man. On the other hand, destroying the only home many have ever known felt cruel and wasteful. Where the first half of the narrative suffered pacing issues and decisions that felt kind of disconnected from the larger plot, the latter half's setup and choices pulled me in completely. The decision in Shatterscarp and the decision in Galawain's Tusks made me stop and think, and they were difficult and morally gray, and there didn't really feel like a right choice. And while they weren't necessarily connected to the overarching narrative of Sapidol and their freedom, they still really challenged me and made me feel like there were high stakes in this story. In the end, I killed Kostya, and I saved Soulless Keep.
I always knew it would come to this.
But it didn't feel great, because I'd been kind of role-playing this character who had chosen freedom and self-determination over anything else, but at the same time, that kind of clashed with this idea of destroying the only home that these people had ever known. Whatever we decide, we continue onwards through the underground passages, which is supposed to lead us to the secret entrance to the garden, and these passages lead us to Nandru's soul, the founder of the keep. We commune with Nandru's soul, which is bound to an Adra pillar, and Nandru entrusts us with a mission, to kill Sapidol. You remember those ancient memories I mentioned earlier? The visions of the past godlike and their civilizations that were betrayed by Sapidol for perceived emotional failings, or sometimes over even the smallest slight? In these visions, Sapidol calls these godlike figures you, implying that the Envoy has reincarnated many times and has been tethered to Sapidol across at least 5 incarnations. And these glimpses into these past lives are incomplete, and Sapidol needs the Envoy to help them fill the gaps, letting the players shape their shared history. These memories, while yes, they prove that Sapidol has brought ruin again and again to those who followed them, also suggest that imprisonment may have changed them, and this deep bond forged across a lifetime, or many lifetimes, kind of sets the stage for the final choice. On one side, you have pretty much anyone who's ever been connected to Sapidol telling you to kill, but on the other side, you have this connection that could mean redemption for Sapidol. But as strong as the narrative stakes had become, and as challenging as some of the story decisions had been, the gameplay loop itself had started to kind of lose its spark at this point. By the time I reached the final zone of Galawain's Tusks, the magic of Avowed's core loop, as I talked about earlier, the combat and exploration, no longer carried the same sense of discovery or reward. The systems that once felt like exciting layers of choice and customization with the gear upgrades and the skill tweaks and experimenting with different builds began to feel pretty hollow. And the reason for this was simply because there wasn't much left in the game to actually use them on. I mean, part of this is kind of poor pacing. When the best upgrades and the most experimental builds arrive so late, there's really no opportunity for you to use them and stretch their legs, so to say. Combined with the fact that in-game enemies aren't really challenging at all. And without a looming threat to truly test your new toolkit, the incentive to push deeper into the game systems just kind of evaporates. And it leads to this weird disconnect in the gameplay loop, because the game is still giving you toys, but it's also quietly taking away the playground. The enemy variety has become repetitive. While the initial designs are strong in the beginning of the game, the repetition of encounters becomes pretty glaring. So when you have this loop that's starting to get repetitive, and no fresh enemy types in this new zone, or any surprising scenarios, even the well-crafted battles start to feel kinda like a chore. And the reason for all this, and my biggest critique, is the lack of a New Game Plus, or any sort of post-game incentive to revisit the earlier zones with your late-game toolkit. You see, if I could carry these upgrades and these builds into another run, or in a more challenging remix of the game, I'd be far more motivated to keep chasing loot and refining my build. But without that, the final hours feel less like a giant crescendo to the game and more like an inevitable march to the credits. And this circles back to the core problem. Avowed tries to be both an RPG and a looter shooter, but this hybrid leaves it unable to fully deliver on either. Avowed gives you the grind and the loot chase of a looter shooter, but without the replayability to sustain it, and the presentation of an RPG without the depth to make it unforgettable. Avowed's final act in the Garden and the Siege of Paradise revolves around two massive decisions and attempts to weave together a tapestry of choices from your journey across the living lands. After arriving in the Garden and fighting our way through, we confront Sapidol, and there are these two truths that we must face. Truth 1. The emotional immaturity and instability of this god who is still learning how to exist has caused the death of thousands of the people who worship them for even the smallest slights, like the felling of the wrong tree. And truth 2. The long imprisonment combined with the relationship built over lifetimes between the envoy and this god could mean that Sapidol can learn and change, and even be something that's good for the living lands. But there's always that risk looming over, that they could snap at any moment and wipe out a city, just like they've done in the past. And it's that duality that frames this choice, to either kill, free, or, if you don't want to do either, merge with Sapidol. Each of these decisions cure the Dream Scourge, but it reshapes the envoy's fate. I ultimately chose to end Sapidol, though it was a painful choice. The thought simply for me is that this character that I was playing has decided throughout this journey that people should have autonomy to choose what they want in life. And a god that could snap at any moment would never really allow for the living lands to truly be free. Though, as I mentioned earlier, I do realize that the decision to save Solace Keep doesn't exactly align with that kind of thinking, which I think is a testament to how well written the last half of this game actually is, as it was difficult to continue to roleplay the character I wanted, and the decisions really made me think. Killing Sapidol ends their threat, and it's a mercy they accept, as they would rather be dead than imprisoned, which is also so brutal and sad, dude. Now, if you had chose to merge with Sapidol, they are no longer a threat, but merging would bind the envoy to Sapidol's will, as a final conversation in the game showed Sapidol actually dictating the envoy's words. And choosing to free Sapidol means that they could snap at any moment and kill a lot of people. But it also means that there's a god that could protect the living lands from the other groups who are vying for control here. After the envoy makes the decision regarding Sapidol, a portal appears, and it's time for the final confrontation with Ludwig. Arriving in Paradise, where weeks have passed due to how the Garden's massive amount of concentrated essence has warped time, Inquisitor Ludwig's Steel Garrote has besieged the city. She's decided she's not waiting, and she's taking things into her own hands to conquer the living lands for Wodica. A camp outside the city is holding the sick and dying and the soldiers, and it also contains people from the envoy's journey throughout the living lands. And in one rare instance of the world reacting to the many decisions made throughout the side quests and interactions in each zone, you have a chance to speak with some of the people that you've helped. After exploring the camp, you can find the leaders of each province gathered, and it's time to make the final choice about the fate of the living lands. I can make either the living lands an Adiran province, unifying it independently, or establish a Grefram, which is a sort of in-between where Adir is in charge, but a governor of the living lands is responsible for the living lands. You can also let the leaders vote on what they think the best thing for the living lands to do is. And this kind of depends on who's in charge, because a lot of the decisions you've previously made can change who's in charge, and certain people want certain things for the living lands. You could also just pledge to the Steel Garrote and alienate all of your companions and allies. Aligning with kind of how I had built this character and the choices that I had made, I chose unification, freeing the lands from Adir. So after the decisions made and fighting our way through the city, it's time for the final confrontation with Ludwig. Now depending on all of the choices you've made up to this point, outside of if you've decided that you want to join her, you can talk your way into her death. Through a combination of dialogue choices based on the choices that you've made throughout the game and skill checks, you can actually convince Ludwig that Wodeka has abandoned her and she'll just die because her devotion to Wodeka is the only thing keeping her alive as a death guard. Or you could just repeatedly kill her until she no longer believes Wodeka is with her after facing defeat after defeat. As an actual boss fight, it's pretty meh. To be fair though, my build was pretty crazy at this point and it has caused me to literally melt through every encounter I've come across, even on the path of the damn difficulty. Side tangent, why does almost every single boss fight in Western RPGs have to be so anticlimactic and weak? Why can't they be like JRPGs and have like these epic, challenging end boss fights? I can count on my hands the number of actual difficult boss encounters in hundreds of Western RPGs just like this. I don't know, it's just my observation. After Ludwig's death, the ending slides play and you see the consequences of your actions. The choice to kill, free, or merge with Sapidal each have distinct slides. Killing Sapidal ends their existence, and we reveal to the Living Lands that Sapidal was the source of the Dream Scourge, but we assure them that the threat is gone. The slide also notes that the Envoy has a sense of freedom that they haven't felt in a long time. Freeing Sapidal releases them to roam. Their rage is softened into love, and some in Fior praise our mercy, while Thirdborn fears another calamity. Sapidal remains a voice in our mind, offering aid and comfort in hard times. Then there are slides that explain what happens to each province of the Living Lands. If you killed the assassin in Paradis, under Adiran Empire rule, Grefrem, or Steel Garrote endings, the rebels are hunted and put down. Under the Unified Living Lands ending, they still hide in the shadows out of fear from the Envoy who killed their leader. If you spared the assassin, they either hide away in the shadows and fight back against Adir, or they come out of hiding and help rebuild Paradis with their skill set, if the Living Lands are unified, that is. If the refugees are sent to Thirdborn from Fior Messiverno, they are accepted and find a way to help Thirdborn. And if they're sent to Paradis, they're originally shunned, but their knowledge of agriculture earns them respect and a place in society. If Fior is completely destroyed, the people never return to the Emerald Stair and stay wherever you sent them. But if you limit the destruction, then the people eventually return and rebuild. If they do return, depending on the state of the Living Lands, it decides the fate of the Animancers. Having to conduct their research in secret under Adiran rule, under a Grefrem they're able to conduct their research, but it's highly regulated and disapproved of, and a unified Living Lands allows them to work unfettered on their animancy, creating great progress. Oh, you can also sell your body to an Animancer after you die, but I don't know, it's just kind of a funny thing, I guess. In Shatterscarp, if the player has sided with Ringgrim, then Thirdborn becomes a powder keg waiting to explode under Adiran rule. Under a Grefrem, however, the trade brought in by Adir is enough to keep the majority content, though they are still unhappy with owing allegiance to Adir. And finally, in a United Living Lands, Thirdborn has a really hard time recovering from the loss of so many of their people in Ringgrim's ritual, and many of them take to the wilds, mourning those who were lost. If the player sides with Ludwig, however, Thirdborn doesn't survive the conflict with the Dream Thralls if they're under Adiran rule, and most abandon Thirdborn. In a Grefrem, however, the Empire does send troops to help eliminate the Dream Thralls, and there's a time of peace between the groups. Finally, in a free and unified Living Lands, handling the Dream Thralls falls solely on the shoulders of those in Thirdborn, and it becomes their norm, to battle the Dream Thralls on a daily basis. In Soulless Keep, if Mihala is the leader under the Empire's rule, the Dwarves of Soulless Keep withdraw from the island once again, and eventually open war breaks out between the Empire and Soulless Keep. Under a Grefrem, Mihala makes life difficult with her reluctance to work with the Empire, and her people suffer from poor trade deals and supply deliveries being made to them last. But they do receive aid, and the Dwarves are better off for it. Under a United Living Lands though, Mihala initially withdraws the Dwarves and closes off the keep again. But after a time of mourning for Kostia, who in spite of what he did was a dear friend of Mihala, she decides to honor his wishes and opens the Dwarves of Soulless Keep up to the island, bringing in a new age of prosperity for the Dwarves. Under Kostia, with the keep destroyed, there is nowhere for the dwarves to return to under the Empire, and many are taken in and become craftsmen and laborers in the Empire. Under a Grefrem, it's pretty much the same story, as the dwarves have spread out and are trying to build new lives in the Living Lands. Though the demands the Empire makes of the dwarves in the Grefrem are larger than Kostia expected, and he's kind of backed into a corner. Finally, in a free and unified Living Lands, the dwarves will spread out, as there is no keep for them to return to, but Kostia spends his final days establishing trade routes for his people, and ultimately, they are successful in this endeavor. Finally, the third and final option, which was the death of Kostia and the destruction of Solace Keep, forces Mihala to lead a people with no home, and the loss of both the keep and her friend make it especially hard for her to live up to her responsibilities. But the dwarves of Solace Keep rally around her, and they rebuild a new settlement from the ashes of the old. As for our companions, Kai will feel empty and hollow and lonely if his quest is not completed, and ultimately he decides to leave the Living Lands after the events of Avowed. However, if you did bring him to Tama's grave, the envoy could influence his future and his plans. This includes returning to Rawatai to petition for peace for his people and to stop the endless wars for Empire. He may also return to Thirdborn instead, and repair the city and train its fighters in order to honor Tama's legacy. Finally, he just travels and chases joy and beauty in the world of Aora, leaving behind the Living Lands and Rawatai. Notably, Kai is the only companion in the party who has any version of a romance, where after his quest, the envoy can confess their love to him, and there is a unique ending slide where Kai and the envoy end up together. You could call them a convoy. I'm really sorry. Marius creates trade routes between Paradise and Thirdborn, and guides traders and travelers between the route for money, telling stories of his adventures with the envoy to anybody who would listen. Though if you complete his quest, and he faces his fears and anxieties, and Solace Keep continues to exist, he becomes an ambassador for his people in Solace and the people of Thirdborn, and he reconciles with the dwarves. Giada's ending depends on what the envoy encourages her to do. If she is encouraged to continue with animancy, she dedicates her work to understand the spirit of the Living Lands and learn how to work with and nurture nature instead of exploiting it. If she's encouraged to give up animancy, she begins just exploring new things, and she finds a strange peace in not being an expert in anything but just learning how to do everything. And there is a third slide that requires that the player has not spoken with Giada about her future and gives her no advice. It means she gets stuck basically where you find her, trying to finish her family's work, but unable to do so. Yatzli helps the Animancers rebuild Fior in the attack if the envoy encourages her to do so and to stay with Quilichi, though she ultimately feels like she's missing something for her life. Under the tutelage of Ringgrim though, she becomes an extremely powerful mage, but slowly loses her connection with her friends and lover as time passes. And finally, if you encouraged her to become a librarian of the godless, then she serves faithfully, preserving the history and knowledge, but as time passes, she becomes increasingly withdrawn and lonely. And one final thing to note is if the envoy decides to either kneel before Ludwin and die honorably or take over as the leader of the Steel Garrote, all worship of Sapadal and anything related to them is destroyed, and laws are put in place to make sure that the only god that's worshipped on this island is Wodika. And there's also a slide regarding a side quest in Paradise, related to a character named Sargamus, who is the godlike of Aethys, the god who marched on the Deadfire and broke the wheel. Depending on what you convinced him to do, if he survived your encounter, you get a slide wrapping up his story. And there was also a statue that Sapadal could inhabit if they were freed, but it is otherwise exactly the same as freeing Sapadal, the ending that is. The ending slides in Avowed are basically the only meaningful payoffs and reactive moments in the entire game. To their credit, they're detailed, they're pretty far-reaching, and most importantly, they reflect a pretty wide variety of player decisions, both large and small. From the fate of entire provinces to the personal futures of individual companions, there's a genuine sense that your journey through the Living Lands has shaped the world. This makes the latter half of the narrative noticeably more engaging, because the stakes feel immediate and the consequences a lot more tangible. That said, the outcomes for your companions feel just as weak as the companion's writing itself. For me, this largely comes down to a lack of investment. Without a strong connection built throughout the game, I simply didn't care enough about their futures to want good things for them, as bad as it sounds. This is especially true for Giada and Yatzli, whose arcs felt very undeveloped and they left me utterly indifferent. Overall, Avowed is a weak RPG that struggles under the weight of unmet expectations. The first half of the narrative suffers from pacing issues and disjointed storylines that don't really connect to the central journey of stopping the Dreamscourge or understanding who Sapadal truly is. Subplots like the fate of the rebels or the Animancer's refuge feels like window dressing. It's interesting at times, sure, but ultimately it's peripheral and it lacks impact on the main story. The same could be said about Thirdborn and Solace Keep, but at least those decisions were difficult and well written. That said, the game's combat, itemization, and exploration are definite high points. Yet even these mechanics feel somewhat underdeveloped. It's a symptom of a game that never quite settles on what it wants to be. Is it a sprawling open-world RPG, or is it a looter shooter? Or is it something in between? Avowed tries to do all of these things, but in doing so, it loses focus. Ultimately, Avowed is a good game. One I really enjoyed, especially played with tempered expectation. If you go in knowing what it is, rather than what you hoped it would be, and you didn't pay $90, the experience is much more rewarding. But for many players, Avowed just represents Obsidian's broken promise. What we thought would be the next great open world RPG from Obsidian didn't fully materialize. And that's why, despite its strengths, Avowed falls short of being the game we were hoping for.